Okay, good morning, friends. Let me welcome you to another session of our Tryst with Vava. In fact, we are discussing Homike Bhava's text of Mimicry and Man. Yesterday, what I did was to give an introduction to Bhava, his background, his Indian origin, his stay in the West, his training in psychoanalysis and post-structuralism, and his investigations into the domain of the colonial encounter between the West and the East, and his nuanced view of this encounter. Now, if Edward Said had blazed a trail in post-colonial studies by giving credence to and emphasis on the politics of representation, whereby Orientalism over the years had become a discourse that tried to perpetuate a categorization of the East as different, as inferior, and in short, as the eternal other to the European self. Then Bhava looked at this encounter from another point of view, from another position. Yes, he was talking about the location of culture, of which of Mimicry and Man is one of the essays. Now, location of culture, if I may be allowed to sound a bit paradoxical, location of culture is all about a twofold comprehension. One, the location of culture, and two, the culture of location. Here, by trying to talk about the location of culture, I am willing to follow Bhava in describing the problematic encounter between the East and the West. So when the West thought about the East from afar and categorized it as different and inferior, it was strong, it was ideological, it was deeply entrenched, no doubt about it. But following Bhava, we may also say that when there was an encounter between the East and the West, things did not remain so straightforward, so black and white. Because any encounter always means interpenetration, interaction, and points of intersection, whereby there was hybridity on the one hand and mimicry on the other. Yes, there was difference, but The entire colonial discourse, having come into contact with the East and the Easterners, the Orient and the Orientals, became ambivalent. It became nuanced. It became problematic. Why? Because on the one hand, when you experience somebody or something different, somebody or something unknown, you try to know it, or him or her or them. You know the unknown in terms of the known. So you compare, you observe, you compare, you categorize, and you build up your attitude to that other in terms of these things. At the same time, however, ideological preconception, prejudice, and real life encounter, practical experience cannot be the same. So if you had thought of the Orient as Said had done, as something inferior, something different, then you also encounter the Orient. In the Orient as something menacing, something dangerous. Similarly, while talking about the categorization of the Orient by the Occident, even though Edward Said had greatly stressed the historical superiority of power and knowledge that the Occident, that the West possessed as compared to the East, as compared to the Orient. But you know, what Bhabha has tried to point out is the fact that, you know, the colonized were not wooden dolls. They were creatures of flesh and blood. They were creatures of brain and brawn. So if you could categorize them, that means if the West could categorize them, view them in a particular light, then they, that means the Orientals, the Easterners, the colonized, they could also look at and conceive of the Orient, the Occident, the West in their own ways. I am reminded of Caliban's vituperation when Prospero, showing a holier than thou attitude, was trying to criticize Caliban. Caliban had once said, I'm talking about this thing, The Tempest by Shakespeare. Caliban pointed out, lashed out in fact, that you have taught me to speak, and my only satisfaction, my only benefit is that I have learned to curse. So there is always an element of subversion. There is always a potentially destructive and subversive element in the act and project of mimicry. Now here we have to understand very, very clearly that when we are reading of Mimicry and Man by Homike Bhabha, we are not only talking about the act of mimicry, we are actually talking about, and we should discuss the project of mimicry, the process of mimicry, whereby it became a two-edged sword. Yes, it was both. It was a weapon in the hands of the colonized. They could pay the Westerners back in their own coin. But it was also a weapon in the hands of the colonizers. By trying to imitate, by trying to mimic, by trying to become like the colonizers, the colonized had invariably run the risk of becoming like them, becoming subservient, becoming co-opted into the colonizing discourse. And looking at the world, themselves and their masters, from the pseudo perspective of the colonizers themselves. As V.S. Naipaul has in his novel, The Mimic Man, tried to point out. So this is what I would like to point out in all humility. Now, I told you to read the text. I don't know whether any one of you have taken the trouble or not. At this juncture, I would like to ask you, where do you stand? And what are your queries? Because I will fashion my response to the text on the basis of where you stand. Do you have any queries at this juncture?
Hello, sir. Can we say that mimicry is a kind of binary opposition between authority and oppression?
Now, Sandipan, first thing you have to understand, is there any binary opposition between authority and oppression? Authority is a word, a lexical marker that has two meanings. Number one, it is the state or condition that gives someone or something the power to control and dominate. Similarly, authority can also mean the person or persons, the community or organization or administration that has that power to control and dominate, and by extension to oppress. So authority is either the condition of power or the holders of power, and oppression is their act. And also the state of the colonized or the oppressed. Oppression similarly can mean the act of oppressing and the oppression, the condition of the oppressed, the act of oppressing as well as the condition of the oppressed. So these are interlinked. Authority and servility can be the two constituents of a Manichaean binary. But authority and operation cannot. Next, any other question? Is Abdul Samad here?
No, sir.
Any other question? Come on, tell me. Okay. In that case, we'll tackle the questions one by one. Tell me. If there are any, what are the questions that I had set? The 5 questions. I will discuss them one by one.
Sir, number one, to be Anglicized is emphatically not to be English. Elucidate.
Very, very interesting. Now, to be Anglicized, what does it mean? Anglicization, if I say Indianize, if I say Christianize, what do I mean? To be or make somebody or something like somebody or something. Yes or no? Are you getting my point? So
Yes,
there is always a difference between the point of origin and the point of destination. If somebody is Anglicized, he or she must have been different from the English. So that was their point of origin. They were not English. And their intended point of destination was to be like the English. But you have to understand that if somebody is not the English, he cannot become or she cannot become English. She can at the most become like the English. Are you getting my point? So there is always some element of difference. And what is more important in the colonial context, there is some difference in rank and status. So if I am Anglicized, I am like the English, but I am inferior to English because I am not English by any stretch of the imagination. Are you getting my point? Now the
Yes,
project of colonization had many dimensions. Military control, ideological domination, all these things were fine. There was also a practical dimension. If you read Macaulay's Minute to Lord William Bentinck, we always go gaga over the introduction of Western education in India. There were certain reasons. Now you have to understand very, very subtle differences are there. From the perspective of the English administrators, they needed Indian workers, employees, who will be aware of and competent in the colonizer's speech and customs. Because importing colonial administrations and employees from England. Here I must actually caution you that I am deliberately using the Indian context so that you can identify, so that you can understand easily, more easily, in fact. Now, importing employees, minor officials, to maintain the colonial presence in India, the East India Company needed money. If they had to import from England, it would cost them more. If they could train people from India, it would cost less. So it was cost effective. Similarly, they thought that by spreading the Western language, the Western customs, the Western education system, the Western religion, and all things with something to do with Western culture, they would make the colonized more subservient and docile, and thereby help perpetuate colonial domination by the West of the East. To be anglicized is not to be English. But my dear friends, you have to understand here an added turn is there, a twist. Because till now we were talking about this process from the perspective of the colonizers. What about the perspective of the colonized? They were culturally different. I am talking about the colonized. They were culturally different and culturally inferior. They were politically different and politically inferior. They were militarily different and militarily inferior. So their inferiority, their weakness, their dependence, all these things were in some ways very clear, not only to the colonizers, but to themselves. Foucault has told us very pointedly how knowledge and power has a great nexus. If you have knowledge, you have power. Knowledge is power. Now, don't you or can't you see, as Bhabha has done so perspicuously? And here we must actually take our hats off to the perspicacity of Bhabha as a thinker. Even though his prose is muscular and in some ways very difficult, logically he is very sound. He is trying to point out that from the perspective of the Indians or the colonized for that matter, metonymically one stands for the other, the part for the whole. You see, yes, there was synecdoche. Yes, where was I? Yes. Now, by learning Western education, Western science and technology, Western political thought, Western philosophical thought, sorry, the colonized could empower themselves. So there was always this ambivalence. There was always this tussle. On the one hand, the purpose was to dominate and subjugate. On the other hand, there was also another purpose to be empowered and to resist in the long run. So to be anglicized was not like the English, not to be English by any stretch of the imagination. But this is something, my dear friends, Bhaba here is very, very clear. This is something that was understood not only by the colonizers, but also by the colonized. And I can also turn it upside down. It was understood not only by the colonized, but also by the colonizers. So there was always this tussle. Okay. So this was my discussion of this particular point. So tomorrow, because there is a national holiday, I don't think tomorrow we will have any class, but day after tomorrow, I will tackle the other issues from this particular essay of Mimicry and Man. I actually propose to complete this particular unit before the puja vacations start. If you have any queries, you are welcome to ask them. Do you have any queries? Is there any other questions? If there are none, you may remove me from the meeting. Thank you for being with me. And when I will take the next class, day after tomorrow, I will let you know well in advance.